as well as strong.
Hello and welcome. I want to start off by saying thank you for joining us for Digital Virtualocity this year. I know it's been a challenging year to say the least, but I am still glad that we're all able to get together, even in an online sense. And I'm glad that we still have a bunch of great content to provide for all of you. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. My name is James Burnham. I've worked for Telium now for around 3 years, and I've been in the digital strategy marketing operations space for about 8. Always had a passion for solutioning in terms of marketing strategy, helping clients figure out what to do with their data and ideating on use cases, optimizing those use cases, kind of helping them figure out, which part of the customer life cycle that we need to attack and where there's potential opportunity for increasing loyalty and retention within our customers. And that's kind of what we're focused on today. I've got 6 use cases here that I personally had a hand in helping implement and helping optimize for a variety of different customers. And it's something that I'm really excited and happy to share with you guys today. So let's go ahead and hop in here. For the agenda, we're going to start off by kind of level setting on the customer data hub. Obviously, this could be a 3-hour conversation just for this one bullet point, but I'm going to do a very, very 1,000-foot view of what Telium does from kind of start to finish. And I'll help you give you an understanding, if you don't know already, how these different use cases get fueled and what we're doing with all of them. So the 5 stages of the customer lifecycle is kind of going to be our table of contents for these use cases. I want to focus in and kind of show you how I would recognize opportunity between each of these stages. And it's an important aspect of how I start to think about what to do for a particular client. So we have a customer life cycle that we're going to go through real quick, and that's going to give us an organization for the rest of the presentation. The 6 use cases themselves, obviously, each of them will be a different part of that life cycle that I described, but all of them are going to go towards increasing that loyalty and retention and overall regard of your brand, so to speak. So they're all going to kind of mesh into that idea towards the end. And then finally, the 6th use case is actually going to be regarding machine learning. We at Telium have Telium Predict, which is our machine learning product, and it's kind of what everybody's talking about these days. So I want to make sure I included at least one use case that talked a little bit about something that we've done with it in the past and potentially give you some ideas of what you could do with it in the future. So starting with the tools that we're going to be working with today, customer data is always going to be the most important part of any equation that we talk about moving forward. I don't care what anyone says. Your marketing use cases are always only going to be as good as the data that you give it. So it's important to know that no matter what we talk about today, the very first step is going to be having a strong base of customer data, understanding who you're targeting, understanding how we can collect that information and how we can pass it along. So this is what Telium does. We're going to be describing how they do that here in a second, but it's a very important focal point that we need to keep top of mind consistently. Customer data platform, CDP, this is kind of the server side aspect to our Telium ecosystem. It's where we're using all of this data, enriching it and allowing to activate it downstream with your other vendors. Then finally, the predictive insights product, Telium Predict, going to be a very important aspect of this. The customer data hub itself, from start to finish, we've got kind of a very generalized view here. Obviously, this won't cover the gambit on all of the different capabilities that Telium has, but it's going to give you an idea and allow us to talk about these use cases moving forward. But if you direct your attention on the left side here, this is our data collection point. So no matter what data source that you have or what kind of data you have, whether it's from a mobile app, whether it's from a point of sale system at a retail store, your online data, obviously going to be one of the more important ones. Maybe your CRM data or offline data that you just have sitting around in a CSV file. We're able to collect all of that. This is what we pride ourselves on, is our ability to ingest that information, standardize it, in other words, make it all kind of talk the same language, and then enrich on it. With our products like Audience Stream, we're actually able to enrich the data to say more about the person that it's talking about. For example, if somebody is in your store making several purchases, we can use that data to create another data point for the average order value or the lifetime order total. We're able to enrich that information to say more about that person. And then finally, and arguably the most important portion of this, is going to be activation. How do we send that information to where it needs to go and to when it needs to go? A lot of these use cases are going to be dependent on timing to make sure that they get the relevant information to the right person at the right time. So we really need to focus in on not only the integration itself, but the segments and the details of that integration. We'll talk a lot about that in several of these use cases. So understanding that from start to finish, we're collecting data, we're standardizing and enriching it, and then we're sending it where it needs to go. This is the general bread and butter of what Telium does, what we're able to accomplish, and what I use to build out a lot of these use cases for different clients. We're going to hop into the use cases here in just a second, but please keep in mind, all of these aspects are going to be used in pretty much every one of these use cases. The customer lifecycle, as I said before, is going to be kind of our organization for the rest of the presentation. The different stages herein are going to be how we decide which use case to use. I'm sure you're all thinking at this point that there is no customer lifecycle that kind of fits every business, every vertical out there, and you're right. Every vertical and probably every single business is going to have their own specific version of this. We've created kind of a much more generalized one that has 5 steps and pretty much applies to every business that I've worked with, at least, whether it's retail or online sales or even membership or SaaS or something like that. You're always going to want to be thinking about these 5 things pretty much regardless. And that's why we put a lot of emphasis on identifying opportunities here. You always want to understand that this is where you're looking to see where the weak link is, so to speak, or where you have potential to do better. So getting started here, awareness, pretty obvious in terms of what it means, the idea of a client knowing or not knowing your brand. And it can go more than this. It could be, are you aware of them? Maybe they know about you, but you have no data about them because they never interact with you. So it's we're trying to begin interaction, essentially. Consideration is after the point of awareness. We're trying to get them to start considering a potential conversion, whatever that might be for your business. A lot of this could be towards, explaining more offerings, describing discounts, and so on. But we're not quite at the point to essentially be pushing them towards a purchase, but we're just trying to get them to think about things. Then the acceptance, we're wanting them to make that first conversion event, pretty self-explanatory there. Then retention, obviously, is going to be a big portion of this. After the actual purchase, we want to have them continuously engaged with your brand, with your domain and your properties and everything else. We want to have them come back and not just disappear after the first purchase or the first conversion. And then finally, advocacy and re-engagement. This is the kind of meshing of that retention, that continuous re-engagement, and pushing them back into the consideration phase, trying to make them start to think about the next conversion they might be likely to make. And as I said before, we're going to hop into the use cases now, but keep in mind all of these steps, because these use cases moving forward should, in order, talk about each one of these stages of the customer lifecycle. So the first one here is going to be awareness, and then consideration, and so on. Well, let's hop in. Creating VIP seed audiences for lookalikes and similar audiences. This client is a very, very popular restaurant chain here in the US. And it's an interesting one to use for awareness because pretty much everyone already knows about this particular restaurant. And the reason I decided to pick it for this is because it's the awareness that needed to happen was kind of on the other side. While pretty much everyone knows about the restaurant, the company itself doesn't really have that much data on everybody, because a lot of their business was in retail and point of sale systems. And while they started to bring that over, even pre-COVID, when COVID hit, it became much more important that we start to focus on online orders, and that requires online marketing. So we set up a system where we're able to collect a lot more of the data directly from the POS systems and everything else. But we wanted to start to build out some lookalike and some seed audiences for lookalikes and similar audiences, which is a very common marketing use case for anybody who ever worked in top of funnel marketing. But what we wanted to do for that was create a VIP list of customers. So customers with a certain amount of lifetime order value, a certain average order value, a certain number of orders per week or per month or per year. And we ended up going through several different iterations of what a VIP would look like, essentially what an ICP was for them, an ideal customer profile. before we came to kind of an end decision on what was our best profile. And those conditions all kind of got built out. It took us around a month to hone in on what we decided was getting the best results. But the cool part about this is that it's automatic. While a lot of customers will do this to some fashion, Telium allows you to essentially be hands-off and let it do it itself. I know several companies who have a guy or a department spending hours per week updating seed lists and verifying that everything's moving along and that the older ones are getting flushed out by the newer ones in terms of the seed list entrance. So Telium lets them essentially check every week if everything is still working. And so far, it's been actually getting us a good number of results in terms of extra memberships inside the database, memberships being a rewards club that they have, but allowing for additional faces, additional customers, for them to build out the marketing stages later on in that customer life cycle. So this is essentially the first step in loyalty and retention, is obviously getting to know the person that you're working with and the client that you have. Really cool use case getting started there. Highly engaged user conversion. Here we have a sports vertical. So a sports team very well known in the US. They had a particular issue with a lot of folks who were on their website, already engaged, already using the website and considering things very well, but not making the final step towards a purchase. And originally we wanted to kind of target towards both single game tickets for this team or season tickets for the team. But we ended up deciding to focus in on single ticket, and then the folks who did convert, we would follow up with season tickets. So the trigger to this was we ended up looking through the analytics and saw that a lot of folks were looking at the game schedule and the mobile app in particular, putting through a lot of events and really being very engaged with that. And we also saw that a lot of those folks ended up buying single game tickets quite often. Eventually, it took time. So what we ended up doing was deciding, okay, let's target the folks who are on the game schedule, who are on the mobile app a certain amount, and see if we can get them to buy a single ticket. But the roadblock here was an interesting one, because as you would imagine, a lot of these team websites, once you go to click to buy a ticket or a season ticket or anything, it transfers it over to Ticketmaster. And Ticketmaster has the information of the purchaser and obviously sends it back to the team. But then us trying to match up that behavior from the visit itself, from the session in the event, is very difficult, because we don't really have a link to see who was the one that purchased and who was the behavior. So it was hard to optimize a little bit, and it was hard to follow up with people who were just exhibiting the behavior and not purchasing, because we didn't have their information. We occasionally had their email or some other information if they put it into like the newsletter or bought some swag, but it was rare. So in this case, we ended up using personalization. We decided to essentially identify the triggers that put somebody in the audience of a highly engaged user with those two bits there that I mentioned, the game schedule, the mobile app. And once we recognize that, we would personalize the next page or screen that they saw to have a single ticket of the next game that was coming up, or if they exhibited any interest in particular games, bring that game to the forefront of their view, make it very easy for them to make that decision. And we saw an immediate uptick in single game ticket purchases. Not only that, but with that particular use case, we were able to expand on it and essentially also look for folks who bought the single tickets and see if they wanted to get season tickets based off of a discount of some kind that they were offering. So it's a really cool kind of 2-for-1 use case here. Ended up seeing some great revenue increases early on. And then additionally, the analytics of being able to identify these trigger behaviors for certain segments is really, really powerful. Moving on here, we have the affinity grouping content update. So we're at the retention stage here. Or I'm sorry, no, this is the acceptance stage, so the conversion stage. And I like this one because it's not your typical type of conversion. This client is an online blog website, essentially, where folks would come and read articles of whatever interests that they had. And the client itself really was interested in having more folks become members, because you were able to browse the website as a guest, but they really wanted folks to sign up and become full-fledged members, just from an engagement perspective and being able to reach out more. So what we did was start to identify what the most likely or the most prevalent categories were that people would read on. And we found through analytics that it was sports, cars, DIY, and agriculture. And then we started to create essentially a tally system inside of Telium where we check a box every single time somebody visits a sports page or an article about sports, cars, DIY, any one of those. And once they reach a certain number of tallies, we enter them into a new segment called sports fan, car fan, DIY fan, something like that. And once that happens, and you can only join one or two, we didn't want to overload them if they joined a bunch at the same time. But once we had those essentially vehicle fans audiences, we were able to reach out to them via whatever way that we had, whether it was display ad or email, if we did have that from something else, to let them know that new articles were available every time that there was new content available there. And obviously through that reach out, we'd also add a whole bunch of places where they could sign up to be a member. And this really did almost immediately, without much tweaking, start to increase the number of memberships joining in. Not only that, but a huge increase in engagement, because as we kind of dug in further, we realized that a lot of these folks were coming by, reading 5 or 6 articles, and then they wouldn't be back for a month. But that's not because they didn't want to, it's just it wasn't top of mind anymore. So once we reached out to let them know that new content was available, they hopped back on and started engaging again. So it was a cool use case that doesn't kind of have your normal kind of conversion there, but was definitely a conversion use case. Here we have a very well-known financial institution here in the US, a bank. And what made this one interesting and why I picked it was because very rarely do I have a client give me very specific information about what they want to do, how they want to do it, and kind of what the specific end goal is. Usually I get someone come by to me and say, we want to increase revenue, we want to sell more tickets or something like that. I'm like, okay, let's figure it out. But in this particular case, the client came to me and said, hey, we have this issue where folks are coming to our website and they have a certain issue that they have in mind, a question that they need to have answered. Most of this is regarding lost or stolen cards, changing payment method, that kind of financial services that we provide. And they're not able to find the right pages that they want just because there's a lot of stuff on our website. And they end up calling into a phone service. And we are spending an exorbitant amount of money paying this phone service to deal with somewhat simple questions that are on our website already. So what we want to do is try and understand the behavior that will identify this frustration, or that they're looking for a particular answer, and then figure out a way to present that information to the person without them having to call it. So a very specific idea of what we want here. And that's exactly what we did. We started to do some analytics on figuring out what exactly was an identifier for somebody having a tough time on the website. What was a identifier of a frustration. And this is kind of what we ended up dubbing it, is when were people having trouble, where, and what can we tell about that? And we started to focus in on the changing payment method issue first, when people were looking for a way to change the payment method of certain bills. And we started to figure out a whole bunch of different identifiers that gave us a good idea of what people wanted when they were looking around on the website. And we started to build out the segments. Once we built out enough segments and we started to test them, are these people actually the right folks? We would kind of do a blind test and see if we could figure out if we were right or not. Then and this is actually still in deployment. We're still optimizing and fixing this one, but there's already signs of success. We started to personalize the pages for the folks that we identify as being frustrated, to either show them, okay, here's the page for changing payment method, or if we weren't sure exactly what they were trying to find, we would show them, okay, here's the FAQs page, the frequently asked questions. And the obvious metric for this, or the final metric, I'd say, is a reduction in phone calls to support. And we are starting to see that at this point. Like I said, we're still deploying, but it was a cool use case, and we're starting to see some positive results already. Moving on here to the final portion of the customer lifecycle. This would be the advocacy and re-engagement portion. And the use case is cruise search affinities timed interval targeting. This is a cruise liner, as you might have guessed. And another interesting case, mostly because usually, like I mentioned before, someone will tell me what their end goal is, and I got to figure out how to get there. In this case, it was the opposite. They brought what they said was an interesting pattern in their data that their analytics guys had, and asked me what we should do with it. So it's kind of giving me the shovel and asking where to dig the hole. In this case, they noticed that a lot of folks were buying the exact same cruise every time they saw an ad for it, or got the impression for that ad, or received something in the mail. They do a lot of direct mail as well. If they noticed that the same cruise that they had been on in the past, and it was always a particular cruise, and usually it was a lot of the same three, but it depended on the person which one that was, they would pretty much always buy it, or they did very, very often. And then the other one was a timed interval cruise, which mostly seemed to be like it was about a birthday event for a person or a company event for a group of people. And they would always buy a particular cruise, whichever one was available, X number of days from each other, depending on the time of year. So this was cool because we had this data here. We knew what the pattern was, and we had to figure out what was the best way to approach this. So we ended up creating some segments, obviously some audiences, to just identify these folks and see if there really was a pattern, if we had enough people to start doing a marketing campaign with. So we built out all these conditions saying, okay, if they keep buying a cruise X number of days apart, let's put them in this audience. If they keep buying the same one, after 2 times, we'll put them in this particular audience. And we started just sending that data off to kind of an Excel sheet that would then post off to either their direct mail service or some display ads that we were doing online. And this one is also still in deployment, but we're already seeing some results as well. It's the same cruise every time it's available is a little bit stronger, but it's just a really cool idea that the analytics is kind of what's fueling this, and we had that before we had the goal in mind necessarily. Obviously, selling cruises is always the goal, but it's cool that we had the idea of what the audiences were before we really knew what to do with them. I like that one a lot. Cool. We have one more use case yet left, but I do want to talk a little bit about the kind of cadence and mapping of how this goes, because I get a lot of questions from clients asking, okay, when do we really want to start focusing in on making sure that we have all these different checkboxes filled for the different stages of the customer lifecycle in terms of use cases? And for me, it's about as early as you can. You want to have Telium set up first. You want to have a software that'll let, or a platform that'll let you collect that data, enrich everything, and send it off to where it needs to go. But as soon as you have that implemented, that's when it's shiny and new and exciting. That's really when you want to start, especially expanding from within the business itself. Start asking yourself, like, okay, what do we want to do? And can it be done in real time? And can we use Telium to do it? Because almost always the answer is yes. And almost always the answer is it would be better if you did, just because of the way that we have things set up. We aren't going to be the person that activates the data, but we can absolutely enrich it and make sure it gets there on time. And that's kind of what I say. And that mindset is going to take you all the way from adoption to growth to optimization, and using those use cases, focusing on the customer lifecycle will round it out and allow that loyalty and retention of all your clients to really proliferate. And the next step, which is another question I get asked a lot, is what do I do after we have these different stages set up? And a lot of folks start to look towards machine learning. Our product, Telium Predict, I'll give a very brief description of, allows you to start to predict the possibility of an action rather than trying to induce it. And obviously the prediction will help you induce or suppress it depending on what it is. So in a 1,000-foot view, what happens is, say we want to predict a particular purchase. Say our goal here is to predict whether or not someone is going to buy a shoe. And what we do is we take that as an event and we say, okay, predict how many of my clients base who haven't purchased a shoe yet are going to buy a shoe. And we take everybody who's already bought a shoe. We look at the different attributes that they have. So each profile that's already got that purchase on it, let's look at the attributes that are associated with that, everything that led up to the event of buying that shoe. Then we build a model and we say that, okay, it seems like all of these different bits of information are correlative towards purchasing a shoe. And we take that model and we apply it to the rest of the database who haven't made that purchase yet. And we are given essentially a coefficient, a number from 0 to 1 that describes the percentage likelihood that somebody will do the thing you're trying to get them predicted to do. And from there, you can start to build audiences based off of the number. So if someone's between 0 and 4, or sorry, 0 and 0.4, which is essentially 40% likely, you probably don't really want to market to them because they're so low, it's unlikely you're going to push them over a fence. On the other side, 4 to 8, maybe we want to do something there. 40% to 80% likely. Maybe we want to try and do something that'll give them the nudge in the right direction. Then 80% to 100%. Maybe they're already so likely we don't want to put a lot of focus on marketing in that area. Just some ideas there. And to talk about the use case that we have for today, the likelihood to complete developer forms is a use case that I developed for a software and hardware company, very, very large, very well known, who had set up a developer's workspace on their website, an area where developers could come and essentially help build solutions and then apply that to a marketplace where others could also use it. What we wanted to do here, and there was a form essentially the developer would fill out to gain access to this portion of the site. This client had an enormous database, and the number of developers was a small percentage of that database. But we wanted to figure out from within that database who was a developer and who wasn't. So what we did was we took the form that led into that portion, checked all the folks who already filled it out because it had been there for a couple of weeks now, which gave us a pretty high number of developers, and then predicted based off of them how likely everyone else was to fill out the form. And what it did was take a look at all the attributes of the folks who did fill out the forms, those developers, and do kind of like a lookalike audience against its own database. It's kind of interesting in that fact, but we essentially looked at the likelihood of other folks who hadn't filled it out yet to fill it out, and that gave us an idea of how likely they were to be a developer. It was a really cool use case that it kind of used the machine learning in an indirect way, but is exactly what we're looking to do with this kind of a product. So big fan there. And that is pretty much it from me today, folks. I want to thank you again for hanging out with me today and talking through some of these use cases. I want to remind you to stick around for the rest of Digital Virtualocity as well. We have a great lineup, and there's some really other exciting folks to see.